Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling public education. It's a big topic, and we've got this article that we're going to be taking a look at today called Too Expensive to Teach: The Systemic Push to Drive Out Experienced Educators. And it's by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD, and it's really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's a really interesting article. The author is a longtime teacher, and they're also autistic, and they're making this kind of startling claim that they might be too expensive to employ.
Yeah, that's a huge statement. Like, how can somebody with, a PhD and all this experience be too expensive to employ?
Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? And it really gets at this tension between experience and the way that our system is currently set up.
Exactly.
We have all of these systems that are supposed to be supporting teachers, funding models, and professional development, and even union contracts, and yet it seems like they're actually working against them.
That's wild. You would think
Yeah.
that experience would be like the most prized thing.
Yeah, you would think so. But this article kind of points to this idea of churn, this preference for a revolving door of, less expensive, less experienced hires rather than investing in those long-term experienced educators.
So let's break down this churn concept a little bit. The article explains that school funding often operates on this per pupil model,
Ah.
which means,
Well, it means that a lot of districts are operating from a mindset of scarcity. They're forced to prioritize budgets over maybe educational needs.
so instead of investing in experienced teachers who command higher salaries because of their expertise, they're having to hire less experienced and therefore less expensive teachers.
Exactly. And the article traces a lot of this pressure back to Reagan-era policies
Wow.
that really emphasized these market-driven solutions and kind of saw these public services like education as being ripe for streamlining.
Interesting.
So it really started to kind of view education through this lens of like a business, and that leads to the per pupil funding model
Yeah.
and the incentive to, hire these less expensive teachers.
So we have this legacy of treating education like a business rather than a public good, and that leads to these decisions that prioritize cost cutting over the quality of the education.
That's a key takeaway from this article. And, this focus on efficiency and measurable outcomes has also led to, the rise of standardized testing
Right.
and this move away from a more holistic approach to education.
It's like they're taking this very complex system and just trying to cram it into a spreadsheet and, valuing these data points over the actual needs of the students and the teachers.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about numbers, it was also about power. So decision-making authority started to shift away from local communities
Interesting.
and towards, these private interests like charter schools and voucher programs and ed tech companies, all of which benefit from the system as it is.
Wow. So we've got this economic pressure cooker created by per pupil funding.
Right.
We have this legacy of treating education like a business. And then we have this increasing influence of private interests. That's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it's important to understand how all of these factors kind of create this perfect storm,
Yeah.
where the system often prioritizes short-term cost savings over these long-term investments in the quality of education.
Well, how are teachers supposed to thrive in this kind of environment?
That's a great question, and it's something that we're going to delve into further in the next part of this deep dive because we really want to look at the author's own experience as an autistic teacher navigating this system.
Absolutely. And what is the impact on the students?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when teachers are struggling, it's the students who ultimately pay the price, right?
Right.
But before we move on, I do want to kind of touch on another critical point that the article makes, and that's about this whole situation with wages.
Okay.
So with budget cuts, you often have schools that are losing administrators, right? And then they end up having to go back into teaching positions.
Wait, so they're losing their administrative roles and then having to compete with teachers for jobs.
Exactly. And that
Mhm.
further suppresses wages for everyone involved. So it's kind of this vicious cycle where, it doesn't benefit teachers, it doesn't benefit administrators, and ultimately it hurts the students.
It's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, it's clear that we've got some serious systemic issues at play here.
we do.
But before we get too bogged down, in all
Okay.
this, remember, understanding these issues is really the first step toward being able to change them, right?
Absolutely. And we will be exploring some potential solutions later on in the deep dive. So, stay tuned for that.
All right. Knowledge is power. So let's dive deeper into the author's personal experiences in the next part and see how their perspective as an autistic teacher can shed some light on this whole situation.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive in the first part. We explored how all these different factors, funding models, market-driven logic, political choices are contributing to this system that often devalues experience in education. But now I want to shift gears a little bit and delve into the author's personal story. Because like we mentioned earlier, they're a fifth-generation unionist,
Right.
which brings this really interesting historical perspective.
It's a powerful connection, seeing how the author kind of draws these parallels between their ancestors' struggles as a worker in the shipyards of Clydeside and their own experience as a teacher today.
Yeah.
It really highlights this long-standing battle against these forces that often seek to exploit workers regardless of the industry.
And that's something that really resonated with me when I was reading this article. It's like this fight for fair labor practices and worker dignity transcends generations.
Absolutely. And, the author makes this really poignant point about how those early unionists understood that their fight wasn't just about wages.
Right.
It was about something much deeper, the inherent value of labor, the sense of purpose it provides, and the respect it deserves.
It's about feeling like your work matters and that you're treated fairly for the skills and knowledge that you bring to the table. But as we've been discussing, it seems like this system really undermines that sense of value, especially for experienced teachers.
Yeah, it does. And, the author, as an autistic teacher, faces these unique challenges within this system that constantly demands, flexibility and adaptation.
Right.
And they talk about how stability isn't just a preference for them, it's a necessity.
Yeah, and that's a really crucial point. This expectation that workers should be able to just seamlessly shift roles or reinvent themselves at a moment's notice. It's just not realistic for everyone.
Yeah, you're right. And for someone on the autism spectrum, who might thrive on routine and predictability, this constant pressure to adapt can be incredibly disruptive and stressful.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this whole flexibility narrative is sometimes used to justify precarious working conditions,
Yeah.
Kind of keeping everyone a little off balance.
The article certainly seems to suggest that job precarity can be used as a tool of control, by keeping workers in this state of uncertainty.
It becomes harder for them to advocate for themselves
Exactly.
or challenge the status quo.
Yeah, it's this divide and conquer strategy.
Yes.
And it ties back to that idea of a reserve army of labor,
Yeah.
having this pool of readily available workers who can easily be replaced keeps wages down, and it prevents any individual worker from gaining too much leverage.
And that makes me think about another point that the author brought up, and that's this idea that capitalism already makes employment precarious for those who don't fit neatly into this mold of adaptability and productivity.
Right, and the article challenges this notion that anyone can just go find another job if they're unhappy.
Right.
For some people, navigating the job market is incredibly difficult, and it requires a level of stability and support that the current system often fails to provide. Right? It's not as simple as just, get another job. It's about access. It's about who gets to participate fully in the workforce and who gets excluded. And when we're talking about public education, these issues become even more critical because we're talking about the people who are shaping the minds of future generations.
Absolutely. And, the author argues that this devaluing of experience in teaching, it's not just a financial issue, it's a form of exclusion,
Right.
And by prioritizing this cheaper, interchangeable labor.
It pushes out those who require more stability.
Exactly, those who might bring valuable experience and different perspectives to the classroom.
Or those who might be more likely to advocate for themselves and their colleagues.
Exactly.
So we're seeing this system that benefits from keeping teachers feeling insecure and overworked and underpaid.
Yeah.
It discourages critical thinking, it rewards compliance,
Right.
and it ultimately undermines the very purpose of public education.
And the author's personal story, as both a unionist and an autistic teacher, it really humanizes these issues,
Yeah.
It reminds us that these aren't just, these abstract economic forces. These are impacting real people's lives, their livelihoods, their well-being.
It's a good reminder that our systems are only as good as the people they serve. And when we create systems that prioritize profit over people,
Yeah.
that devalue experience and that punish those who speak up, we all pay the price.
That's true, but, the author doesn't leave us in a place of despair.
Okay.
They actually challenge us to envision a different future for education,
Okay.
one where these harmful systems are dismantled and replaced with something better.
Okay, so that's encouraging. So how do we get there? What would a more just and equitable system look like?
Well, that's the question that we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be examining some potential solutions, and we'll be diving into the author's vision for a future where public education truly serves the needs of all students and teachers. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Too Expensive to Teach. And we've uncovered some pretty disheartening realities about the system. But,
Hmm.
as we wrapped up the last part, it seems like the author believes a different future is possible. So let's talk about that. Like, how can we shift these systems towards an equitable future for public education?
Yeah, you're right. The author doesn't just leave us hanging. They actually lay out some really interesting and thought-provoking ideas for how we can create a system that, truly values experience and supports teachers and puts the needs of students first.
Okay, so let's get into some solutions. What are some of the key takeaways here?
Well, one of the most important points I think that the author makes is that austerity, this idea that we just don't have enough resources for public services, like education, is a political choice. It's not an economic inevitability.
So it's not about a lack of resources. It's about how those resources are being allocated
Yeah.
and what our priorities are.
Exactly. If we genuinely value education, then we need to invest in it accordingly. And that means adequately funding schools, making sure that teachers are paid fair wages, and creating a system that supports their professional growth and development.
You can't expect teachers to pour their hearts and souls into their work when they're constantly stressed about making ends meet or feeling undervalued.
Right. And the author also challenges us to kind of rethink this whole business model that has become so pervasive in education,
Yeah.
moving away from this narrow focus on efficiency and standardized test scores and embracing a more holistic approach to learning that really recognizes the individual needs and potential of each student.
It's about seeing students as whole people, not just data points, and creating learning environments that nurture their growth and development in, all its complexity.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that, the diverse needs and strengths that teachers bring to the classroom. Valuing experience means understanding that those years spent, honing a craft, building relationships with students and communities, navigating the complexities of the education system that has immense value.
What are the role of private interest in education? We touched on that a little bit earlier. It seems like the author is pretty critical of that.
Yeah, the article makes a clear distinction between, those who see education as a public good versus those who see it as an opportunity for profit. Charter schools, voucher programs, ed tech companies, all of these entities often benefit from the dismantling of traditional public education.
So we need to be aware of these dynamics and advocate for policies that, protect and strengthen public education as a truly public institution.
Absolutely. And the author emphasizes the importance of collective power, whether that's through supporting teachers' unions, advocating for strong labor protections, or simply working together to create a system that values experience and fosters stability.
Because when teachers feel supported and secure, they can focus on what they do best, which is teach.
Yeah.
And, that creates a ripple effect that benefits not just the students, but the entire community.
It's all interconnected. The well-being of teachers, the quality of education, the strength of our communities, it's all tied together.
Okay, so we've got a lot to think about here, but before we wrap up this deep dive, is there any one final message that the author wants to leave us with?
I think the author's ultimate message is this crisis in public education is not inevitable. It's the result of choices that we've made, often driven by ideology and a desire for profit. But we have the power to make different choices.
So it's about reclaiming that power and demanding a different future for public education.
Exactly. And that starts with awareness, understanding how these systems operate and how they impact real people's lives. And then it's about action, engaging in critical conversations, supporting organizations that are fighting for a more just and equitable system, and using our voices to demand better.
That's a great call to action, and I think it speaks to the power of this deep dive. It's about taking this complex issue, breaking it down, and equipping ourselves with the knowledge and insights to actually make a difference.
You said it perfectly. It's about empowering ourselves to become, informed and engaged citizens who can contribute to positive change.
So to all of our listeners out there, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, just remember that education is something worth fighting for. It's the foundation of a just and equitable society, and it's up to all of us to make sure that it thrives.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. If the current system is designed to fail, as the author suggests, what does a reimagined future for public education look like to you? What would it take to build a system that values experience, that supports teachers, and that truly serves the needs of students? Think about it, discuss it, and most importantly, act on it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.